Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett.
I'm Derek Van Gorder.
Today we're talking about the currency crisis in Zimbabwe that started with the hyperinflation of the Zimbabwean dollar from 2007 to 2009, which ultimately ended with the abandonment of the currency altogether. After that, Zimbabwe didn't have a currency of their own and instead adopted a mishmash of foreign currencies. For today, we read a 2014 BBC story entitled Zimbabwe's Multi-Currency Confusion. Now, a lot has happened in the 7 years since the story was published, including an attempt by the Zimbabwean government to reestablish their own currency, only to see worrying inflationary tendencies crop right back up again. So there are some interesting questions we can ask here. What happens when the functioning of a currency breaks down? What makes it possible for a state to establish and maintain a stable currency in the first place? Why did Zimbabwe in particular fail? What can they do better in the future? And would trying to implement a basic income help, or would it make the situation more complicated? Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot's been said and written about the poor economic decisions that were made prior to this becoming an issue in the first place. Bad land reforms, it messed up the agricultural output, those sorts of things. What I'm sort of interested in is in the recovery process and how this article highlighted that multiple currencies had come into use in the vacuum. And I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts about how does that occur? I mean, when hyperinflation starts to get really bad, is that bad for a while and people just live with it and then they're going to switch over to these new currencies? Or is the fact that other currencies are in use, does that kind of have to happen? Is that inevitable? And does that happen inevitably as this hyperinflation is taking off? I'm sort of wondering which drives the other more once you really get into the thick of it. And also, like, how does a central bank react to multiple currencies being in use? How do you do monetary policy, if at all? Are you just subject to other currency flows entering the economy? So I was kind of curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, well, what you're really talking about is a failure of the currency. So when you have a currency that's hyperinflating, what's a big part of what's happening is that it's becoming not the currency anymore. You can't set prices in terms of it reliably. You can't make payments really using that currency anymore. I mean, they try to stretch as much as they can, and we saw in like Germany and everything, the wheelbarrows full of cash and all of that, and people switching into the currency as quickly as possible and then making the payment. So there's a minimum amount of time between when they get the currency and when they make the payment, so they don't lose the purchasing power, or they try to minimize the loss of purchasing power. But that's not a properly functioning currency. And if you have hyperinflation, then you're going to find some other way to keep track of prices, to not only put your savings into, but to think about the value of things. You're not going to be thinking if the purchasing power of the currency is decreasing by half every few weeks or something like that, or even faster than that, then you're not going to be thinking about value in terms of this unit anymore. You're going to be thinking in terms of something else, like maybe how much bread is my salary going to buy me, or something like that, rather than how many Zimbabwean dollars is it going to be? So then, you're right that there's kind of this self-reinforcing mechanism, right? If there's hyperinflation happening, then people aren't going to want to use it as the currency. And then if people don't want to use it as the currency, everyone tries to get out of it as quickly as possible whenever they have any Zimbabwean dollars. That reinforces the inflationary cycle, because nobody wants to hold on to it. So who do you pass it off to, right? If everyone's trying to get out of it. So there's kind of a feedback loop there in that respect as well.
Yeah, but something to point out here, I think, is, like you said, it's a failure of the currency. Mm-hmm. And I think we live in a world where, okay, there are these separated national economies with their own national currencies. And so, saying that the economy is doing poorly and the currency is doing poorly are kind of the same thing. Like, if people are relying on this currency to get their daily goods, then they're in a bad spot when you lose the functionality of that currency. But if in a situation where some other currency came along, like, I can imagine maybe if the Zimbabwean economy dollarizes and somehow they actually get a supply of dollars that they can use pretty well, and they sort of join the dollar network, as it were, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem for the economy there. It just means that currency is not being used anymore. So I think people sometimes, maybe when you think about there being when there's hyperinflation, um, we're not necessarily thinking about um, a separation between what the currency is actually giving people, what role it's providing in the economy. Like I think people aren't thinking about a possible scenario where maybe there's some things we just don't want to use as a currency anymore because we have something better now. So that we don't, you could say the Zimbabwe, maybe the Zimbabwean currency can remain hyperinflated indefinitely, but if they came up with some other currency they're using instead, then we would just stop measuring it, right? It wouldn't matter. Of course, it's hyperinflated because it's not serving a function. It doesn't have a purpose there anymore.
Yeah, it's basically not a currency anymore. And we can ask the question, if you just switch to a new a currency that's already stable, then is there really any problem, right? And I think there are two main problems with that. So one is in terms of the transition. It's always going to be a bumpy road because you had something you were using as your standard currency, and it's not easy to just flip a switch to something else. That's like saying, okay, we all speak English, but English as a language has become terrible. So we flip a switch and we all speak, Spanish tomorrow or something like that. That's not an easy transition. Of course, if we were all, speaking Spanish, one language is pretty much as good as the next, and, that's fine. But you do have to focus on that transition. I think switching currencies is maybe easier than switching languages, but it's still not a straightforward transition, right? It's not something that happens all at once. It's something that happens as things are falling apart and you're trying to kind of rebuild in a new way. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, right? Like Europe switched from, its individual currencies to the euros, but that was kind of a planned transition. And really the euro is like the new Deutschmark and that kind of thing. It wasn't like something failed and fell apart and then they replaced it with something that worked. So that's one issue, the transition. And then the other issue is that if you are a country and you don't have a currency that's managed by your own institutions, then there are certain things you can't do to kind of facilitate the smooth functioning of your economy. So if you're Zimbabwe and you're depending on the United States dollar as your currency, that means your central bank is not in control of monetary policy anymore. Now, maybe that's a good thing from a currency perspective because your central bank wasn't doing a good job anyway. But there are other problems like maybe interest rates actually need to be lower for things to be, for your optimal financial sector, or I don't know. There's a lot more flexibility you have when you have your own institutions managing your own currency.
We can get into the article a bit, but they mentioned at one point that the central bank, this is more in more recent times in 2014, they actually were allowing and accepting and even encouraging different multiple currencies to be in use. And so there were some currencies that were legal, some that were not, and they actually started adding more to be legal because they wanted more money coming into the economy. So does that speak to maybe the central bank not having that kind of direct control, and they don't even have direct control over the legal currencies that are in use, and they're actually trying to bring in more currencies just to get more possibilities for spending going on than there are at present? I mean, I can't imagine that's super comfortable as a consumer, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point of currency is that it's a single common standard that everyone in the economy shares. Like it's a single pricing and payment standard, right? So if you have multiple different standards, you can kind of muddle through that way. And again, the analogy to languages, it's like, having multiple official languages, and some people speak some languages and some people speak other languages, and you have to kind of translate between them, right? It adds a layer of complexity. So it's not optimal, but there are, other, we live in a globalized economy, there's international trade, and there are currencies that are functioning in the world that Zimbabwe can use for their own internal purposes or to trade abroad. So that's certainly something that it's not surprising to see that they would be trying, since they couldn't really have their own currency.
I've heard that since
Bethany,
they...
did you have something you want to say? Bethany, I noticed you unmuted your microphone.
What? Oh, sorry. No, Annabelle did that, I think. Sorry about that.
Okay. All right.
No problem. No questions from there yet. I guess I've read that. So since then, there was all these different currencies in use. I guess the dollar emerged as kind of a predominant one or a popular one. And since then, I think they've actually recently been trying to sort of de-dollarize. They want to get adoption back to a Zimbabwean dollar. I don't think it's going very well. What would be your advice, right? Like to a currency managing institution, a central bank, where there's not an established currency, yet there's other people's currency maybe in use that it's not really super available. What are the first steps that a central bank could do to kind of recover from this and actually give markets the confidence that it's able to issue a new currency that it can reliably use?
Well, I would look back to the gold standard. So back when, 19th century, most of the, Western European countries and the United States had currencies that were backed by a certain ratio to gold, a certain ratio. Yeah. So when you look at that, the responsibility of the central banks, or part of the responsibility of the central banks, was to manage their gold reserves so they could keep their promise of having the currency be redeemed in the appropriate amount of gold. And you can do something similar with a dollar standard, right? Like it doesn't need to be a gold standard anymore, but the dollar is already out there. And if the the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe wanted to hold a reserve of dollars and make a promise about the redeemability of a new currency in terms of dollars, US dollars, and they demonstrate that they're able to keep that promise over a very long period of time, then eventually they can more directly manage instead of actually having to hold a reserve of dollars and redeeming it right away, or redeeming it directly for anyone who wants to come in and exchange their Zimbabwean currency for dollars. You can start to transition away from that direct backing, the way we transitioned away from the gold standard, and then they could have a free floating currency. But they really have to establish that they're able to maintain that stable currency with respect to the dollar, and then transition into maintaining a stable currency with respect to consumer prices.
One of the things I've heard, apparently they've tried this a couple of times, trying to reintroduce their own currency, and one of the things I've read that people say is causing difficulty with that is what black market speculation on this new currency. And I couldn't really find a coherent analysis of what that entails. What do you know what they mean when they say that? Like when you're talking about people speculating against a new currency from taking off?
Yeah, speculating against a new currency from taking off. So, I mean, there's always ways to beat that. In terms of what you would speculate, you'd probably, you'd probably be like shorting the currency, like George Soros did with the pound when they were in the European stabilization mechanism, and that's why the pound, or why the UK isn't part of the euro, right? It's all George Soros's fault. But you can short currencies. You can do that. When you're talking about black market, when you mention that,
well, because they technically outlawed the US dollar. I forgot to mention that.
Yeah, so that's part of an issue. When a government is trying to outlaw certain transactions, that's like price controls. That's like saying you're not allowed to buy certain things at certain prices. Then black markets kind of emerge. The way to prevent black markets from emerging is to have good monetary policy, right? So if you're doing the monetary policy that keeps your currency stable already, with respect to the dollar, if you're pegging to the dollar successfully, then you're not going to see the black markets emerge. And you also don't need to ban it, right? The fact that they're banning the dollar in the first place is a sign that they know that their monetary policies are not in keeping with keeping their currency stable with respect to the dollar. So they're trying to force it, right? So you already know there's a problem there. I wouldn't blame the black markets. I'd say the black markets are really a symptom of the fact that you don't have good monetary policy.
Right. So if you're a government and you want to reinstate your currency, you don't recommend banning the currency that's currently in use. You would say try to issue the new currency in a way that's filling a void that the other currency isn't available, or it's not able to reach.
Yeah, I would say provide something that's better than the alternative, right? Like even when the Zimbabweans are using dollars, they're it's not easy for them to do that, right? There's not really any small change that they can get. When they go grocery shopping, they can't really get change, and the bills that they're using are all tattered and have to be taped together, and like it's not the most convenient thing in the world, but they're doing it because it's still better than the alternative of the Zimbabwean currency. So what you would want to do is, if you're the Zimbabwean central bank, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, is you want to provide something that's stable. And it can even be pegged to the dollar. And essentially what you're doing then is you are printing your own Zimbabwean dollars, and you're setting things up so that they can be exchanged one-to-one with United States dollars. Instead of banning the United States dollars, make it so that they can be exchanged one-to-one. And then people will have no reason to exchange them anymore because they know they can, right? And they can just spend the Zimbabwean dollars instead. When Brazil was having an inflation problem in the 1990s, what they did was they created a new unit, a new pricing unit. So there was no actual currency being handed back and forth in this unit. Instead, they had an inflation index, and they would have this pricing unit, like a milk would cost something in the standard unit, and then you'd look up the price of the currency that day, and you'd spend the appropriate amount of currency. So the price tags were in one unit, and then the thing you actually paid was in another unit. And then over time, as they got used to pricing in this unit, then they started issuing tokens that you could actually spend that corresponded to that unit. And of course, now you have to make sure that the amount of tokens that's out there, the flow of those tokens being spent, is stable in a way that keeps prices stable. So it's not, you're not going to just end up in the inflationary scenario again. So I can imagine Zimbabwe doing something like that, having a pricing unit, and after people get used to the pricing unit, turn it into have tokens that actually represent that pricing unit that people can use as a means of payment. But then, of course, they have to do the right thing and keep that unit stable.
Bethany just asked in the chat, can we go over again what led to the hyperinflation and why it crept back when they tried again? And I think we can do that, and that might also answer Richard's questions above, which is he was wondering what are the differences and similarities between the famous Zimbabwe, the Weimar Germany, and the Venezuelan hyperinflation episodes. So what was it? I know from past reading that in the case of Zimbabwe, there were a lot of problems before this occurred. There was the most famous one, the one you hear a lot about, is the land reform. So there was a lot of land that was acquired by the government out of the private sector and redistributed, and apparently it wasn't redistributed in a way that made the agricultural output increase in a way that increased the productivity of these farms. The opposite occurred. It was apparently output fell by 50%. So you have a case where the public sector is taking resources out of the private sector and remanaging them, and not doing a good job, doing, in fact, a very bad job. But I think that the important point to stress is that problems like production problems with the economy's resources, that can happen in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. It's not enough for that to occur for there to be hyperinflation. There has to be something else that goes wrong in order for, instead of people just getting poorer, or instead of you losing goods, right? And you're actually also having a problem with the currencies. Maybe Alex can speak more to that.
Yeah, I think another major factor with Zimbabwe was that the government was trying to fund one side of a civil war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So they were really kind of overcommitting their resources. So the land reform made their land less productive, made their agriculture less productive. So that meant they had fewer resources to commit in general in their economy. And then they were committing kind of beyond a level that was possible, right? And this is kind of a common thread in hyperinflation. So we talked about the feedback loop of people don't believe in the currency anymore, and that feeds back into the hyperinflationary mechanism because everyone's trying to get out of the currency. But there's also, you can nip that in the bud. It's possible to nip that in the bud if you are the government and the government institutions. The problem is what you're doing, which causes hyperinflation, is that you are promising to activate more resources than you're able to activate. So in the case of Weimar Republic Germany, you had reparations after World War I. And basically the Allies said, you have to do these things that are impossible. And Germany said, no, we can't. And the Allies said, no, you really have to. So then Germany is like, okay, we're will do all the things that we're supposed to do, and the things that they were supposed to do were not possible. So they did, as much, as much as they could, and that required spending more, committing more resources than their economy had on an ongoing basis, not just doing it once and saying, oops, we overcommitted, let's pull back, but on an ongoing basis. And that's hyperinflation. That's what hyperinflation is. With Venezuela, you had the price of oil crash in, I think, 2014. And then that made their oil production unprofitable because they have really hard to refine oil. And their entire economy was depending on, by then, for various reasons due to various problems, it was depending on exporting oil and then importing all of the other things they wanted and needed. They didn't really have a robust economy that could produce their own stuff. And rather than just saying, okay, we can't really sell oil anymore, now we just have to be poor, they said, well, we want to compensate by giving everyone money or ensuring they're, pumping more money into the economy. So you had another case of committing more resources than you had, or committing to spend on more than what you were able to spend on. And in their case, they didn't want to accept the increased level of poverty, or the decreased wealth that kind of was automatic with the increase, or with the decrease in the price of oil. So they instead did a similar thing. So in any case, in any hyperinflation, the government is overcommitting resources. In the case of Zimbabwe, they overcommitted resources because they were willing to do whatever it took to win this war, and they also at the same time decimated their own resources through the land reform. So and there were also issues of, we don't want to be poorer than we were. So it was a kind of a combination of all three. Now, in any of these cases, except maybe Germany couldn't really make a choice. Everyone else was telling them what to do. It wasn't their fault, really. But Venezuela, they could have decided, okay, we're just going to be really poor. People are going to be hungry, which is what ended up happening anyway. They just, didn't want to admit that that's what was going to happen, and that ended up making it worse, because not only were they poor, but they had a currency that wasn't functioning, and then the markets weren't functioning, and it made things even worse than it would have been if they just kind of accepted the oil shock. And then for Zimbabwe, they could have not done the land reform. They could have not committed resources to the war in the DRC. But they, well, I don't know. I don't know what their political pressures were, right? I actually don't know as much about Germany. Maybe there was pressure, just like there was pressure on Germany, and they didn't really have a choice. I'm sure they felt like they didn't have a choice. Sometimes you feel like you don't have a choice because of political reasons, right? You have to answer to the public, and the public doesn't want austerity, or the public doesn't want to be poorer. And if you don't do what the public says, the public will vote you out of office and elect someone else. So maybe you don't have a choice, and then the hyperinflation is inevitable.
But then I think I want to say, and I could be wrong, but I want to say that even in those situations where there's a lot of external pressure that's sort of forcing your hand in one direction, I mean, there's a lot of levers, different levers that policymakers have available, right? So it's not just war spending. I mean, all the government spending is part of that. All of the management of the private sector spending, right, is also something that you can, it's more difficult after you've totally lost control of the currency. You don't have a functional currency to control anymore, but you do have levers that can either expand or retract the flow of private credit for promises for that currency in your economy and the spending that generates. And so if maybe you have a lot of political pressure to do X or Y, like maybe there's a lot of political pressure to go to war, to meet these war demands from other foreign nations or something. Well, then you can pick something else to sacrifice in order to not get into this territory, presumably. So, I mean, I think the reason why I would stress that is because if we're talking about a country that's sort of trying to nip inflation in the bud and doesn't want to, is having problems with their economy, their currency, but wants to shore that up, I think that the problem with just saying, well, it's a problem of overcommitting the resources, it's also a problem of how they're doing that. And I think it would seem really counterintuitive to tell people who are worried about inflation, like, well, maybe you should try introducing a basic income to kind of protect a basic level of demand, but then start tightening these other areas of the economy, that to them would sound that's crazy. But actually, if you're counteracting an increase in demand with a tightened private financial sector, the basic income wouldn't solve the hyperinflation problem, but it might be a good idea for fostering the growth of your own private sector while tightening it in on the edges and actually preventing the overconsumption from occurring.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point about tightening monetary policy, and Germany in the 1920s did not tighten as much as they could have, right? They were issuing government debt at a certain interest rate, and some of it just wasn't getting bought. So the central bank had to buy it, right? If instead they had auctioned it off, right, and people, were bidding at enough of a discount that they could sell all of it, maybe that would have mitigated some of the problems. You might say that there's no length to how far they could have gone in doing these kinds of things where the allies wouldn't have kind of pushed them beyond that limit. So there are limits they didn't hit. It's not clear to me that going to those limits would have saved them. In terms of basic income and hyperinflation, one of the things, especially one of the tricky political things that contributes to hyperinflation, is that when governments are worried about the economy, they're worried about employment. They're worried about ensuring that people have enough income through jobs, that kind of thing. And employment is notoriously lumpy and uneven, right? If you stimulate employment, that doesn't mean everyone's going to get a job. It means some people are going to get more jobs and higher pay and that kind of thing. If you have a basic income, that takes some of the pressure off of stimulating employment, and that can make it easier to tighten monetary policy. So if you look at a place like Zimbabwe, especially today, right, like they're having similar problems today that they had in 2008, 2009. They haven't had any more land reform recently. They haven't had, they haven't been funding any civil wars in the DRC lately, right? But they're still having similar problems. And part of that is, they have unemployment problem, right? So if you introduce a basic income, then that starts to look like less of a problem, and it starts to allow you to run tighter monetary policy, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I guess I think the reason why I bring that up is because I think people are sometimes, you don't want to say that that hyperinflation is caused just by the dramatic the event that occurs, the shock that occurs to the economy, because it's actually, hyperinflation isn't necessarily caused by that. It's necessarily caused by a mismatch between the spending and the resources that are available. So like in theory, if keeping a stable currency was the number one overriding priority, I mean, you could walk down with that, but we often have these other concerns, these other goals that we want to achieve. So it's just a question of what is it easy for us to actually change our priorities in response to events like this occurring? I don't think that is super easy when your spending is primarily politically determined. I like monetary policy because it's not politically determined, right? And it's a lever that's there and it's available in theory anyway. When economists or the central bankers decide that they need to do that, then they can do that. But I think that in some countries, like in similar situations in this, when I've read about what the central banks have done, then they're not, sometimes the central bank is just totally an arm of the government, right? And they're trying to make the promises that the government is committing to, and they don't have that independence that would allow them to react to government overpromising in the public sector, right? I actually don't know that much about what the central bank in Zimbabwe was sort of doing or up to in that time period, right, when this was all occurring. I'm not really sure what actions they took or didn't take in reaction to that. But it seems like to me, that's a good argument for having that, what people talk about, that independence, that semi-independence of the central bank and the government, because you have something that can react to shocks like this. And politicians react to shocks, but like we've seen in the COVID environment, like it takes a while. It takes a while for everybody to agree, okay, there's a horrible crisis. Here's what we've got to do. Here's what we're going to increase spending. Here's what we're going to decrease spending. That can be slow and bumpy. Whereas it's useful when the currency is devaluing today, it's useful for someone to be able to step in and do something right away.
Yeah, the topic of central bank independence is interesting because there's a sense in which central banks kind of are independent, and there's a sense in which they're not. And I think sometimes people are worried about the sense in which they're not independent and think that that's a violation of central bank independence or something like that. The way in which central banks are not independent is that if they're running monetary policy properly, then they're responding to everything that the fiscal authority is doing. And the fiscal authority is, of course, politically motivated and all of that. But they're responding in a way that keeps prices stable, keeps the financial sector stable, maybe. And the way in which they are independent is that the decision to to have a certain monetary policy that responds in the appropriate way is not going to be necessarily pushed around by political motivations. So it's not the case that the fiscal authority can be spending way too much, and then maybe there'll be political influence that'll say, hey, central bank, you need to keep interest rates low and also do things stimulatory from your end of thing. That's the kind of central bank independence that's good, is that you can't kind of push the central bank to do something that goes against the kinds of stability that they're trying to achieve. But in order to achieve the kinds of stability that they're trying to achieve, they do have to respond directly to the government. So in that sense, they're not independent.
Right. I see what you mean. Decision-making independence versus actual functional independence. I'm with you. Right. Do you want to go? Was there any quotes you picked out? I mean, from this article that just to kind of put us in that frame of mind of people who are looking at this from back then in 2014 as a problem, and the kind of the thoughts people were expressing about it?
Yeah, so in 2014, Zimbabwe is really getting into this multi-currency phase. So let me share this this quote here. I definitely think there is going to be confusion caused by so many currencies. For a cashier to be handling so many currencies at the same time, says Denford Mutashu, general manager of Food World, a nationwide supermarket chain. So the point that he's making here is just that, kind of what I was saying earlier, the currency is the standard pricing, and it's the pricing and payment standard, right? If people are using multiple standards, then it gets confusing, and your currency isn't functioning optimally. So this is a real concern when you start introducing multiple currencies into a particular market. And even in the article, they talk about how some cities tend to use one currency and some cities tend to use another. So it's not really a stable situation either. The market will tend to find one standard and coordinate on one standard because that's what's efficient.
This is clearly just someone who's running a store there who's having doubts about this new policy where the central bank started allowing other things to be used as legal tender. Of course, even before they were allowing that, it was the case that people were starting to use other things as legal tender. So what I find interesting about this situation, obviously it's not a good place for the economy to be in. This is not desirable in any way, but I do find it interesting that it kind of, when you think about an economy that's okay, they've had to throw out this currency, it's not worth anything, it's not useful, and they're starting to find other currencies to use. It does sort of show how there is, there's still businesses there. There's still people who have goods that want to make transactions. They want to get stuff done, and so they're latching on to stuff they can find. They're still actually finding a way to make transactions in the meantime, and I think it just maybe shows that like the automatic assumption people sometimes have between the fiat currency, a government's issued currency, and then what markets are using, those are often aligned. They can often be the same thing, but they aren't necessarily, right. These people still needed to have markets, and they still need to set prices and pay prices, even when the government had messed up their fiat currency. And this persisted for quite a while, right? And they've been using the US dollar for a while, even though they're not issuers of the US dollar. Their US government doesn't have a say in what goes on in that country, really, not directly. And so, I think there's people who might want to, I think it just puts a little bit of a wrinkle in the idea that, okay, so the market's pricing standard and what the government has on offer are always the same thing. Because in this case, it's not, the government's standard is not in use. They're using a different government's standard, which isn't there, and they're trying to get by on that. And I think that it brings to mind interesting questions about, like, could there be, especially in like war-torn regions or regions where there's no functional currency, could there be a role for a non-governmental entity to kind of come in and provide currency as a service, provide currency as a means of filling in this gap that's not being met. It's not being met.
Yeah, I mean, I think once you have an institution that's issuing a currency that people are using, it starts to become harder to argue that that's not some form of government. Uh, I think yeah, and I think if you're adopting a currency as a country, you want to adopt the one that is stable and good, and that people will use. And that's probably going to be the dollar or the euro or Japanese yen or Chinese yuan or something like that. It's going to be something that's established and works. I don't think you're going to see a private currency issuer come in and be able to offer something that's going to compete with the United States dollar. Maybe unless they're kind of tailoring it somehow to the Zimbabwean economy or something like that. But again, you're kind of you have some institutions that are taking over part of the management of the Zimbabwean economy at that point. And you could say that maybe when they're using the dollar, that the United States has done that, even though they don't care, right? They're still, the decisions that the Fed makes are going to be decisions that impact any country that uses the dollar, and even countries that don't use the dollar. Right now, the Fed's monetary policy is going to affect interest rates around the world because it affects exchange rates, and everyone's connected and all of that. So it's really hard to the central banks, the big central banks, to say, oh, we're only worried about our own domestic economy, because in practice, anything they do affects everyone.
Well, right. So if you're going to make the case that, okay, so the currency issuer for a region sort of inherits public responsibility in some sense for that region and for that economy, that does kind of flip the perspective a little bit, because for a while now, Zimbabwe's been using the US dollar because that's sort of what's popular outside the borders and what the foreign countries are trading with. So they've latched onto it. And once that occurs, we kind of can't really keep saying, oh, well, their dollar is broken, their economy is messed up, they got to fix it. They're kind of using our dollar, which we're providing to the world. And so in a way, you could say, does the US government have an obligation to make sure that the Zimbabwean economy is doing okay, that they'll be able to use the dollar well, and that there's a good source of US dollars entering the economy to make sure it's effectively a part of, we don't think of it, right? We don't think of that as part of our economy or part of our society, certainly. But the currency is not respecting that boundary. It's going there anyway, and it's getting economic stuff done anyway.
Yeah, you could ask that. And then you could also think back to the gold standard, where the international currency is gold, and there is not really any single issuer of gold or something like that. And then whose responsibility is it? So if you wanted to, you could argue that, Zimbabwe is just treating it the way we used to treat gold, and it's not the responsibility of the Fed or something like that. But the gold was not completely responsibility free either, right? Most of the countries left their gold convertibility during World War I, and then one by one they went back on to the gold standard. And as they did, each time that tightened the reserves of gold that were available to the international economy, and caused problems for other countries that were on the gold standard, that kind of thing. So it's hard. So you can make arguments both ways. You could say, like, hey, this is this thing that the United States is doing, and they're doing well enough that we're just going to piggyback off it, and they don't have any responsibility to us. Or you could say that, hey, realistically, we need to acknowledge that these relationships exist. And if we do acknowledge that, then maybe the Fed can take responsibility for certain things, and everyone can be better off by the Fed taking action and actively managing things, not just for the benefit of the United States citizens, but for the benefit of everyone. And I think to some extent they have. Maybe not for Zimbabwe directly, but certainly there's collaboration between the big central banks that's been going on, especially since 2008.
And to be fair, I think in the current policy framework and the way of looking at the problem, and how you mentioned before about how what we're trying to stabilize is employment, despite the fact that it's kind of lumpy and uneven, doesn't respond well. It is sort of hard to imagine how a US dollar, currency issuer could really intervene in a meaningful and important way there directly. I think once you start thinking about basic income the way that we think about it on the show, where you do have an option available to sort of put your currency into a place where it's currently not quite directly. I wonder if that's easier. I mean, if it was normalized where the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government were the issuers of U.S. dollars, and that's what people were using in many different places across the world. Is it really just a simple matter of, okay, well, we want to take monetary responsibility for this region, so this is the amount of basic income we're going to distribute into this economy, which will fund that economy's production. To me, that seems really simple and straightforward. But if you're trying to answer the question of like, well, how would we get employers to start paying wages in this region and then have people use those wages to buy things, it seems a little more complicated, a little more difficult to imagine currency going across borders that way.
Yeah, I think before we even bring basic income into the picture, if you're talking about the Fed and their monetary policy, what they can do is fairly limited in terms of influencing financial markets. So they can decide, do we want our policy to benefit the United States, or do we want it to benefit the global economy, right? But it's not going to be like, oh, we're going to do this for the benefit of Zimbabwe. We're going to do this other thing for the benefit of Panama or United Arab Emirates or something like that. And then we have this other thing that we're doing for the US domestic economy, right? It's like the Fed does one thing that affects everyone. So they have to decide who they care about the most. Now, with something like basic income, that again is, if the United States wanted to pay basic income to the world, that again affects everybody. But it might, it doesn't go through the financial markets. It's not about, kind of stimulating investment, that kind of thing. It's more directly kind of getting the consumer economy going. If everybody has a little bit of money to spend, then everyone's a potential customer, and you can build the economy kind of more from the bottom up that way.
Yeah, and that's a very different. That goes into our whole like global basic income discussions. It's a very different perspective, and once you're there, then the whole thing changes. It doesn't really make sense. Like there's, instead of trying to solve the problem of how do you kickstart the Zimbabwean economy to become more productive so it can pay out more wages to people, it's like, well, maybe this is a part of the world where there's not a lot of production going on because we have it taken care of in other countries. And just like how we're not surprised that there's like a rural part of Alabama somewhere that's not a hub of industry, maybe we don't need Zimbabwe right now to be a hub of industry. Maybe we can let them consume from the other nations more, and then maybe some of their citizens will start producing more stuff later. It becomes a very different thing. And it's certainly not the framework that these articles are looking in. Richard asks in the chat, the article mentions worries about increased influence of China by use of the yuan. Is the outlawing of the US dollar about the worry of the US in Zimbabwe? And I'm not sure. I mean, that might be some of it. When you have currencies attached to particular governments, I think these do become kind of political concerns and questions. People are like, are foreign governments starting to have control over us? But there's even if that is the case, there's good reasons why in their situation now they would want to have their own currency for all the reasons Alex talked about. It's important for them to be able to perform their own fiscal and monetary policy independently because they don't have access to those levers otherwise. They're not in a world where China or the US is sort of going to be performing benevolent fiscal policy with them as primary beneficiaries. That's just not the world we live in today. So even if there's political concerns there, like it still ultimately makes sense for them to want to have their own currency in the current environment.
Yeah, and I think there's also, there's the question of why do they want independence from the United States dollar, and that could be related to, not wanting too much influence from the United States and U.S. institutions. But then there's the question of why did they outright outlaw it? Why did they ban it, right? And I think that's more of a reflection of the fact that they couldn't, or that they weren't willing to do the things that they needed to do to gain independence from the United States dollar through normal market mechanisms. They weren't willing to do the things that were necessary to establish a stable currency on their own that would outcompete the US dollar in the Zimbabwean market.
Right, or potentially they weren't even aware really of what exactly the right steps to take were.
Sure. Yeah, we can be charitable to them in that respect. And Neil says in the chat, he points out that we have currency swaps between central banks, which is a way to help particular countries. And I think that's right. I think most of those are about protecting the global financial system in general. So, a lot of these central bank agreements emerged in the wake of the 2008 crisis, and they were trying to stabilize the global financial system. But it's certainly true that we have currency swaps with some central banks and not others. So there is a dimension there in which our central bank, the Fed, is helping some other countries, but not others.
Any other quotes from the article you might want to pull up?
Yeah, let me get the next one. This one is actually about the Chinese thing. I am not happy using these currencies, says Cuthbert, a 45-year-old taxi driver. We do not know the currency, even the exchange rates. I do not think it's necessary to use this currency. Even the banks can lie to us. His colleague, Farayi, 20, feels the introduction of the yuan heralds yet more influence from China on the economy. They are trying to get the whole African market, so it is a way of colonizing in some sense. What do we benefit out of this Chinese currency? That's the big question, because at the moment, these guys are not banking here in Zimbabwe, but actually they are taking the money out of Zimbabwe, he says. So I think to some extent that's true. China wouldn't be kind of promoting their currency in Zimbabwe unless they got something out of it, unless they got some benefit out of it, right? And you hear a lot about Chinese firms investing in real estate in various places to kind of get a foothold. Investing and buying up debt from various countries, that kind of thing. Now, so that's true. China is kind of trying to get more powerful, get more of a foothold in various ways. But it's also true that the Zimbabwean people wouldn't be using the currency unless it provided some benefit to them as well. So there's kind of a mutual thing going on. And of course, there are going to be some people who resent that it's happening, that kind of thing. I don't think the yuan really took off in Zimbabwe after this article. It was mostly dollar stuff. At one point they had 12 different official currencies in Zimbabwe, and none of them were the Zimbabwean currency. They were all foreign currencies. But I think that kind of simmered down a little bit. It narrowed down to more like the dollar and maybe the pound a little bit. And then more recently, they banned the dollar, of course. And they banned all currencies, I think, except for the Zimbabwean currency. So, yeah, I think a more important feature of this quote is just the confusion around it, and the fact that you make everything more complicated, and then things are going to happen that aren't efficient. It's hard to get all the information. So he's saying the banks can lie to us. Well, it's a lot easier to lie to people if they don't understand what's going on. And when you've got a bunch of currencies kind of floating around and nobody can keep track, it's a lot easier for people not to know what's going on.
Yeah, I mean that's right, but I do think it's important to note that like you said before, they're getting something out of it, which is that they have a reasonably functional currency, at least one more reasonably functional currency to kind of use and make some transactions with, because they're lacking a standard one. They don't have one that's available, and so it's not that. I don't think it's a huge problem with China coming in trying to influence their economy necessarily. Like, the real problem is that they lack a currency, and so people are trying to use whatever they have to use to get by. And so I guess I just would emphasize that, like, if you don't want another person's currency to come in and influence your economy, then you should make sure your economy has a stable currency, right? So there isn't that void to fill.
Yeah, and if you're doing a lot of business with China, then the yuan is a really convenient currency to
Right.
keep accounts in.
Right. And I think in a that's what I was trying to get at before in kind of a messy way, was that all of this way of framing the issue makes sense in our world, where each nation is in best position to put out their currency, and they've got to manage that well. Sometimes they get it wrong, and then problems like this occur. But like, if I think about a world where there was people in a world where basic income is normalized, and actually it's kind of a normal thing for currency issuers to grow markets by dispensing more currency. I feel like there's more of an argument if you're in a country that has a crappy currency or has lost the use of its currency. There's a better argument available for let's take these guys' currency because they're offering it for free. It's available, right? We can get a little bit of it and we can start using it, and that creates. There's a better argument for that once it's actually easier to get currency in the first place. When is it so important that you live in a territory, right, that is, the name on the currency is the same as the name that's on the buildings of the government? I'm not so sure, right? If the base money issuer is doing a really good job of providing a basic income for your region, then I'm less concerned, right, about having my own control over these other things. If I'm looking at a government that has messed that up, has a history of messing that up, right? The calculus starts to change in that scenario in a way that I don't think it can change today, where that's just not on offer. That's just not an option. So that's just something I'm sort of trying to keep in mind. But I realize that it's not how most people are thinking about this issue. It's outside most people's idea of what's possible.
Yeah, and Bethany is asking in the chat, why did they end up using multiple currencies instead of just one, for example, the dollar or the euro? And I think the answer is that they didn't, that this was a phase they went through and it was not stable, and they ended up kind of converging more on the dollar. And I think that's kind of what you would expect. If you just remove your domestic currency, then all you have left is the currencies that you were using internationally, right? So kind of by default, you start with, the people who are trading with China using more of the Chinese currency, and the people who are trading with Japan using more the Japanese currency. And then, locally in your own markets, you do see individual cities kind of converge on a standard. Like in this article, they were talking about how, one city tended to use one currency and another city tended to use another currency. But I think it very quickly, resolves in such a way that you don't have particular instances where multiple currencies are being used at the same time in the same place, right? Like people kind of quickly standardize.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so let's get to another quote from the article here. So let's see. For economist Christopher Mugaga, the introduction of new currencies is not the solution to Zimbabwe's economic woes with its chronic unemployment and shrinking manufacturing sector. So I think this points to a couple of the tensions that the Zimbabwean institutions are facing here, which is that they're worried about unemployment, and they're worried about how much stuff they're producing, that kind of thing. If you were thinking more from a consumer perspective, it's more about, okay, well, not can we employ everyone, but does everyone have the means to participate as a consumer? And even a very tiny basic income accomplishes a tiny amount of that. And if you have people sitting idle who could be doing something productive, then people around them having money is a great way to activate that. But you wouldn't activate labor for the sake of activating labor. You'd activate it because people actually have the demand, right? So I think that's, and I think more generally, the idea that new currencies is not a solution to problems in the real economy. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, currency is supposed to facilitate production and consumption and trade of actual stuff, right? Your economy has to have the actual stuff. It has to be able to produce the things that people want or trade for the things that people want and need. So you can't fix all your problems just by introducing new currencies, or even just by having a functional currency. But I would say that having a functional currency is kind of, if you don't have that, you do have problems. So the absence of a working currency is going to cause problems in your real economy, and that's why everybody's going to try to find a currency, and that it's not a stable situation to have no currency or to have multiple currencies.
I think there's a lot of untapped potential in this kind of situation for something that doesn't get a lot of attention in the U.S. in the basic income discourse. But in this kind of situation, it could be really, really useful to be talking about introducing a small amount of basic income. In the U.S., we have this really big productive economy, and we're trying to debate what social programs we spend on, and people are worried about the basic income not being enough. When you have a really faltering economy, the currency's broken, you need to try to get things going again, but in the right direction. A tiny amount of basic income, low enough so that there's not really a chance of it causing any kind of inflation, but what you're doing is you're just incentivizing production, consumer-oriented production from your economy's businesses. And it's like the kindling that can get a larger fire going. And that's, I think, a really good example of where you could get a lot of benefit and a lot of power out of just a tiny amount of money going in people's hands, even if it's not as high as advocates would like at the current moment. But it can put in something that's missing, and it can get the economy moving forward in a better direction, so that you can pay out a higher one later.
Yeah, instead of trying to get everyone employed, you give everyone the means to activate whatever economy is there. And that's what basic income does. And maybe a consequence of that is more people are employed, but the employment is serving something else. Instead of targeting the employment directly, you're targeting the consumer, the ability of the consumer to consume, to claim something from the economy. And then when consumers have that, then that creates an incentive for firms and workers to produce something for people to claim with the money. Yeah, but you wouldn't. It's kind of backwards if you're trying to produce first or employ first, and people don't necessarily have the money to get the benefit from that production.
Right. What we want is to employ people through consumption, through consumers, not the other way around. What a concept.
I know, right? So we are getting towards the end here. I'm actually, I'm not an expert on Zimbabwe's particular situation, but my sense is that if you admit that you're poor, then you're going to end up being less poor. And then you can, and same thing with Venezuela. If you can stabilize your currency, have a very, start with a small amount of basic income, and just have your markets function, have your economy function, even if it's at a very low level. Having that stable foundation allows you to build from there.
Right. Hyperinflation is when the nominal spending has vastly exceeded what's really available. That doesn't help. If you want to get more real wealth, you've got to set your nominal wealth according to your real wealth. And basic income is really just a very convenient, simple means of doing that. It's a way of adjusting the nominal spending going on in the economy.
Yeah, and it's an evenly distributed way of doing it. If you're stimulating the financial sector to stimulate employment, that's very uneven, and it's not going to get the economy activated for the benefit of everyone. Okay, any final thoughts, Derek?
Not really. Just like you, I'm not an expert in this particular situation. I'd like to talk to people who are. But I think right now I think you've covered most of the major sort of hyperinflationary episodes on the podcast. So hopefully, if people are concerned about that in the future, they can just go review these archives. But just having this discussion does make me think actually how maybe the scenario of a hypothetical economy having trouble with its currency or having trouble with its economy is a good way to think about how a basic income works, because it's a stress testing scenario. It's where it's where really you would demonstrate, is this an efficient program, right? If you have an inefficient program, public program, and your economy is doing great, then you can kind of throw inefficiencies, you can pile them up for a long time and you'll never notice. When your economy is really in dire straits, that's when the rubber hits the road, and you actually have to have a policy that really directly and succinctly kind of gets the objective done that you want to achieve. So the question of whether basic income can work in these scenarios, I think, can actually be a really useful, conceptual exercise for understanding how it works.
Yeah, and if you have basic income as a lever in your toolbox, then it might prevent you from using some of the other levers in ways that might ultimately end up being destructive.
Right.
So yeah, great discussion. So we're going to be starting something new next week. Starting next week, we're going to be reading Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, and we're going to be going through a chapter a week, starting with the introduction next week. So Boston Basic Income is shifting gears for a couple of months. I'm sure we'll get back to more individual topic discussions, but we wanted to go deep on this book because we just thought it would be a very interesting thing to do.
I'm looking forward to that. And if you guys do want to go into explore those other discussion topics, other topics besides the deficit myth for a while, definitely check out my new show on my YouTube channel. I'll be streaming every Friday or weekly at least. And I'm happy to entertain all manner of subjects related to money and basic income there.
Yep. Check out Derek Van Gorder's CMT live stream. Thanks, guys.